learn more about the Mythic Dawn cult, which involves us getting all 4 volumes of the Mythic Dawn commentaries on the Mysterium Xarxes by Mankar Cameron. We get the first 2 copies easily. Strongarm a goofy little Bosmer for the 3rd volume. The Wood Elves in this game look like actual cartoon characters. And we stage a meeting with the cult itself to get the 4th volume, as only members have copies of it. It's a fun little collection of quests that has you scoot around the Imperial City, helping you get real familiar and intimate with it. And once we have all the books, we learn that the first letters of each paragraph points us towards a grave with a glowing map on it. Has nobody noticed this before? It's right outside the Imperial Palace, glowing like it's a damn neon sign. And it points us towards the location of the Mythic Dawn secret club. We head there and infiltrate the cult, and we see Mankar Cameron himself giving a speech to his followers before he teleports back to his own plane of oblivion. And it's a pretty cool scene. But I've always had a problem with the Mythic Dawn though. They're a doomsday cult that is spread across Cyrodiil and are led by Mankar Cameron, who is a Bosmer, Altmer,
you'll get more than
elf, who created the cult after he obtained the Mysterium Xarxes from Mehrunes Dagon himself. The Xarxes being a magical book and Daedric artifact of great power that's allegedly full of dark powers and prophecy. Mankar Cameron is a very mysterious individual, being the bastard son of the usurper king Haemon Cameron and his mistress, the Cameron dynasty being a well-established Bosmeri dynasty that ruled Valenwood for most of its history. But Mankar himself appears as an Altmer in-game, and the explanations for this discrepancy can range anywhere from that he's a more noble Bosmer, Bethesda made him an Altmer so people would take him more seriously, and so he's not the same race as the Adoring Fan, all the way to him using Mehrunes' razor to retroactively alter his Nimic, aka his true name in nature, to become an Altmer through the power of the Mysterium Xarxes or some shit. None of this is revealed in game, and I have no clue. Maybe he's none of that and just some unnamed piss elf's bastard son who was given a magical book. Who knows? Regardless, with the Xarxes in hand, he wrote his 4 commentaries on it, which outlines a master plan from Mehrunes Dagon himself, and promises that all those who serve him will go to a paradise upon death. This paradise being Cameron's own personal plane of oblivion that he created through the power of the Xarxes. And through their service to his cult, they will be reborn as immortals in a new Dawn Age of Tamriel. The Dawn Age being a non-linear period of time at the creation of Mundus, where the gods were omnipresent in the world and magic flows endlessly. From these commentaries, he was able to grow his cult, and the cult became so widespread and well-established, they were able to wipe out the entire legitimate Septim bloodline in one night, and were able to build 60 Oblivion Gates all across Cyrodiil, and they have sleeper agents embedded in every city. And there will be times in the game when an unassuming NPC will reveal themselves as a Mythic Dawn member and attack you. However, people don't just join murderous doomsday cults for no reason, and this is where I feel the Mythic Dawn falls flat. The only reason you want to join this cult is to either go to paradise upon death, or to bring about a new Dawn Age by bringing the Daedric hordes in service of the Daedric god of destruction and run a train on Tamriel. And these are Daedra we're talking about, who are so notoriously evil, they're often described as demons from hell. And I don't think either reason here is a good enough promise to warrant such a lethal loyalty to this cult. The 4th volume of the commentaries does help a little to give the cult a more understandable lens to view them through, as it tells the story of Mehrunes Dagon's creation, telling the story about how Dagon was created in a sort of parallel or alternate version of Tamriel called Lig, which is a whole lore rabbit hole unto itself. And Lig was ruled by the tyrannical Dreg kings, the Dreg being those weird crab octopus beastmen enemies from Morrowind. Dagon was created as a prince of good and was imbued with hope, and rose up against the Dregs, freeing their slaves and destroying the Ligian tower of Chim El Garjig, and spread his destructive hope all over the world. And it seems that the Dawn want to recreate these events in Tamriel instead. But no matter how many great Michael Kirkbride lore stories we get, unfortunately, we don't get any real deep looks into why the cult members really joined up, or want to serve Mankar and Dagon with their lives, or how well connected and capable they are. And it probably isn't easy to assassinate the Emperor's 3 sons and the Emperor himself in one night. That takes a lot of manpower and planning. And doing all of that in the vague promise of a nondescript paradise of eternal life, and an even more unclear mythical Tamriel doesn't really add up for me. The Mythic Dawn has some pretty interesting ideas and beliefs. Along with the Dagon creation myth, they also believe that Nirn is a plane of oblivion unto itself, and it's the plane of the missing god Lorkhan. And since Lorkhan is dead in a way, the men in Myr are an occupying force of Mundus, which really belongs to the Daedra, namely Mehrunes Dagon. But in truth, the Mythic Dawn cultists are getting jobbed, being pawns of Mankar Cameron, who himself is a pawn of Mehrunes Dagon. When we reach Mankar's paradise later in the main quest, we meet some Mythic Dawn members who had died and gone to paradise. But instead of eternal life and endless elven pussy to swim in, they'd rather get endlessly tortured and killed by the Daedra there, doomed to a cycle of being reborn, being brutally tortured or killed by the Daedra, dying, and repeat. Maybe this could be fixed if Mankar had more development and dialogue, or if the Mythic Dawn had more NPCs we could talk to really pick their brains about why they joined up. But they only had Terrence Stamp in the booth for a short amount of time, and Mankar only makes a few brief appearances in the entire game. As it stands, the Mythic Dawn is a really interesting idea that is lacking some serious development. And outside of Mankar's screeds we hear in Paradise, and the esoteric at best commentaries themselves, we learn almost nothing about the cult's history, how well connected and established they are, why the Mythic Dawn cultists truly believe what they believe, and apparently all you need to form an empire-destroying cult is to promise an afterlife, and some console command powers to some commoners. But anyway, undercooked cultists aside, after Mankar gives his speech, he takes the Amulet of Kings back to his paradise and disappears. We are then forced before the cult, and I have to sacrifice an Argonian they have prepped for a ritualistic shanking. I shank the lizard, but after I realized I wouldn't be able to get any extra info on the cult or their history from Mankar's daughter, or any of the other unnamed Mythic Dawn goons in this place, I steal the Xerxes and kill every cultist in sight, and return to Martin. Martin figures he may be able to find a way to open a portal to Mankar's paradise using the Xerxes, but he's not quite sure yet. In the meantime, we head to Bruma to deal with even more Mythic Dawn agents. Man, these guys are just fucking everywhere. And once we slaughter them, we return back to Martin, who has made some headway on the portal to paradise. We will need to gather 4 items for this ritual. The first thing we need is a Daedric artifact, and you can offer him any one of the 15 artifacts you can obtain in the game. And I really like this mission structure, as it not only opens up the game for the player to do any quest they like, but it also forces you to make a choice on which artifact will be destroyed from your save file, as Martin eats that shit up during the ritual. The game points you towards Azura Star by default, but Azura Star is one of the more useful artifacts in the game, being an infinitely reusable Grand Soul Gem. So instead, I decided to sacrifice that nasty bitch Namira's ring, as its mild damage and spell reflection was something I could live without. So I help her ugly ruin-dwelling followers to slaughter the priests of Arcade trying to bring them into the light, get the ring, and return to Martin. Man, being a Namira worshipper looks like it sucks ass. We give Martin the ring, and then talk to Joffrey, who tells us an Oblivion Gate has opened in front of Bruma, and to go close that joint up right now. It's another standard Oblivion Gate crawl, but at least we got my dad, Bird, backing us up. We close the gate and report back to Joffrey, who will start the Allies of Bruma quest I mentioned earlier, which is thankfully optional if you don't feel like clearing out 6 almost identical hell dungeons. But I did it all anyway because I love labor. Your reward for slogging through these gates is a bigger and more colorful friendly army to back you up at the Bruma Mega Gate battle later in the quest line. And the extra backup is really nice for keeping the Daedra off you, as well as making the battle feel more epic. Well, as epic as we can get, but it's totally not required. And I feel like most people just jack down the difficulty for this fight anyway.
No, I fucking haven't.
The Daedra that swarm out of the gate will whoop your allies after a little bit. And remember, getting ganged up on in Oblivion is the worst possible situation to be in. But before we do any of that, we must first get the second ingredient for our ritual, which is the blood of an Adric god. This is pretty interesting, as despite their reverence among the people of Tamriel, the Adra are pretty absent from Nirn, and their artifacts are extremely rare, like the Amulet of Kings, which is an artifact of Akatosh. But luckily for us, Martin has a really solid lead on our Adric artifact, that being the armor of Tiber Septim himself, which is held in the bowels of Sancre-Tor. Sancre-Tor is a pretty interesting place lore-wise, being built as a capital city by the slave queen Alessia, being the place where Tiber Septim defeated the Nordic invaders of Cyrodiil, and is also the mythical birthplace of the founder of the Second Empire, the one and only Remen Cyrodiil. But in practice, it's a pretty unremarkable dungeon delve with an interesting gimmick of freeing 4 Blades ghosts who will allow you to enter the inner sanctum and receive Talos' armor. As it seems at some point, Zurin Arctis, aka the Underking, came to Sancre-Tor and took a nasty shit all over the place, filling it with evil spirits and curses. But our ghostly friends ward off the curse, and we snag the armor and return to Martin, who then asks us to obtain a great Welkin stone from an Ayleid ruin, our next ritual ingredient. The Ayleids are this game's obligatory extinct elven race, whose ruins dot the map like the Dwemer ruins that jut out all over Skyrim and Morrowind. And I like their presentation. The Ayleid ruins have this post-apocalyptic high elven architecture, looking like as if you dropped a nuke on Rivendell, which lets them stand out from the technological architecture of the Dwemer. The Ayleids themselves were the original elven inhabitants of Cyrodiil, also known as the Heartland or Wild Elves. The Imperial City itself was originally an Ayleid city, and the Ayleids, much like their Dunmer counterparts, had moved to modern Cyrodiil after schisming with the other Aldmer, over, you can probably guess, yeah, Daedra worship. And in Cyrodiil, they built their many elegant cities and were very adept at magic, using Varla and Welkin stones to store and harness magical power. However, as time went on, the Ayleids became more and more tyrannical and sadistic, becoming almost cartoonishly evil, enslaving the humans who had migrated into Cyrodiil, who would revel in torturing their slaves, and even made an art out of human torture and violence, making, quote, flesh sculptures and gut gardens, and would even brutally slaughter children. These guys were Molag Bal and Mehrunes Dagon's strongest soldiers. And as this violent decadence continued, a slave woman who we only know as Alessia made a pact with Akatosh and the other divines to free her people, and he gave her the Amulet of Kings, and she rose up in rebellion against the aliens. And this rebellion eventually wiped them all out and drove them into the far wilderness, where their race mostly fizzled out, and their cities fell to ruin, where they remain until we find them in oblivion. So I cut my way through these buff-ass zombies and skeletons squatting in the ruin, and I grabbed the Welkin Stone after another solidly standard dungeon clear. And we return again to Martin, and now it's time for our final ritual ingredient, the Great Sigil Stone. But that means we must let a massive Oblivion Gate open in front of Bruma, so we can enter it and grab the Sigil Stone. So me and the gang all head over to Bruma, and we get this great little moment where we parade through Bruma with Martin, who has Don Talos' armor, and the crowd cheers us on as we go off to fight some well-leveled Daedra. I fight off the Daedra, and with so many friendly NPCs fighting with me, the hardest part of the fight was making sure I didn't accidentally murder anyone. And once the large gates open, we run inside to take on the most unique Oblivion Gate in the game, as we have to close it in around under 15 minutes, or else the walking siege engine will escape and destroy Bruma. The time limit makes this game way tenser than the other ones, and you may clench your ass a little bit. But it's still just kill the Daedra and touch the stone to win, and that's exactly what we do. And with the Sigil Stone in hand, we have everything we need to enter Mankar's paradise and end this chicanery for good. We create the portal and enter paradise, and this is probably my favorite part of the entire main quest, as we get some pretty good, but limited lore exposition. Like I mentioned earlier, we find that this paradise isn't all it was cracked up to be, and the Mythic Dawn cultists who died are now indeed immortal, but now they live as fodder for their Daedric overlords, who hunt them for sport and dip them in lava for eternity. Some members are in denial of the reality of the situation, and are coping that this torture is all just a test for the coming Dawn era, but most are completely disillusioned with the cult, and we even get help from the guy who opened the Kvatch gate, which is a great little character moment for a Mythic Dawn member, which is extremely rare, as most members are unnamed NPCs or have nothing interesting to say at all to you. So we go through the Savage Garden, the Torture Cave, we make it up to Mankar's palace, and the whole time Mankar is speaking to us, giving us interesting lore bits about how Mundus is the Oblivion plane of Lorkhan, but then he makes some weird mistakes, saying that Cold Harbor is the realm of Meridia, when it actually belongs to Molag Bal. That's pretty weird though. Script issue maybe? Anyway, once we reach Mankar's palace, he gloats to us about Dagon's upcoming invasion in his new Dawn era, and he and his two shitty kids attack us. But I guess Mankar has gotten pretty lazy after 400 years in paradise, and the dude is a total slouch, and I stagger him to death with my glass longsword, and I take back the Amulet of Kings. We return and find Martin, who has donned his Imperial regalia, looking just like his pops. We give him the amulet and head to the Imperial City, and speak to Chancellor Okado. But as we speak to him, the city is attacked by Mehrunes Dagon himself, so we head outside with Martin, and we dodge some Daedric minions and the big guy himself, and quickly escort him to the Temple of the One, where he then makes the ultimate sacrifice, mantling Akatosh himself to turn into a massive flaming dragon, who gives Dagon a nasty neck bite and destroys his form on Tamriel. However, the burden of mantling Akatosh took everything out of Martin, who strikes an epic pose before he solidifies in a rock, marking the true end of the Septim bloodline. But with his sacrifice, the barrier between Oblivion and Tamriel has been permanently closed, and no longer requires the Dragonfires to keep the firmament intact. And with that, that's the end of Oblivion's main quest. We get congratulated by Okado, who gives us a reward of some custom Imperial Dragon armor, which has maybe the longest wait I've ever seen in a game, as you have to wait 2 in-game weeks to get the armor.
I'm waiting.
That Imperial bureaucracy is nasty. Oblivion's main quest has some pretty great moments, like the attack on Kvatch and the final battle between Martin and Mehrunes in the Imperial City. And these moments have held an impression on this game's fans for over a decade. But the main quest itself is surprisingly short, and is padded by quests like Allies for Bruma to get as much mileage out of it as possible. And outside of those previously mentioned quests, in the Daedric quest, the remaining main quest missions are mostly your standard dungeon crawls. The Mythic Dawn has some interesting beliefs and lore that make you question the nature of Tamriel and the Divines, but the cult itself is far too underdeveloped and vague to leave a lasting impression on players, and they mostly exist to further the plot through some nondescript means. Hell, they even knew Uriel had a bastard son in Kvatch, so unless Mankar was reading the game's script through the power of the Mysterium Xarxes, the Mythic Dawn must be really powerful, really well connected, and must have a vast network of spies and agents that run almost all the way to the top of the Empire. We never get to learn if that's the case or not, nor do we really learn what compels normal citizens to join up with this cult, beyond your typical reasons of power and eternal life. And there is a woefully small amount of dialogue and lore from the Mythic Dawn members, which leaves me unsatisfied with that part of the story. I enjoyed how the main character in the story was Martin, not the player, and it gives the main quest a pretty unique perspective from the other main quests in the series. And I also really liked how Mehrunes Dagon, in a way, still won the Oblivion Crisis. I mean, sure, he got chomped and exploded off the face of Tamriel, but through his machinations, he had ended the Septim Dynasty and had removed the need for Amulet of Kings and Dragonfires to keep Tamriel and Oblivion separated. So who knows what that will mean for Daedric moral interactions in the future. And it's very interesting to speculate on if this was his true plan, or if he actually wanted to conquer all of Tamriel like Mankar claims. Overall, the story is a mixed bag of some high highs and some pretty undercooked lows. But the shortness of this main quest is supplemented by 5 factions with full quest lines for each, minus the arena, which is like half of a faction, rather than a complete one like the Dark Brotherhood. I won't be going into detail about all the factions, as again, we'd literally be here all day, but I'll go over them in more broader strokes, as they all, minus the arena of course, try to tell a self-contained and interesting story that highlights the strengths of each faction class alignment. I'd go more into depth with these factions if I made an Elder Scrolls factions focused video. We'll see. But anyway, first up is the arena, as it's likely the first faction you'll join. It's a great place to get some early game skill training and money, and it's really close to where you're birthed out of the Imperial sewers and into the open world. But it's pretty unremarkable, being a series of battles where you ethnically cleanse the yellow team. Not much to write home about, but it's easy to join and get fighting in right away, and I'm glad it's a feature at all. It makes the Imperial City feel more alive and believable. Next up is the Fighters Guild, and it's your expected mercenary work, and kicks off a questline with a fun reversal of Morrowind's first Fighters Guild quest. But it's probably the most underwhelming faction not called the Arena, and has a pretty rushed story about combating the Blackwood Company and their lethal business practices. And you even end up tripping balls on his sap and slaughter an entire village of civilians thinking that they're goblins. But the story falls flat towards the end, and it takes 2 morally gray factions and turns it into a more generic good mercenary company versus an evil mercenary company story. Next we got the Mages Guild, which is essential for any magic-focused character, as spellcrafting and the best magic resources and trainers are locked behind getting 6 recommendations from each city guild hall after a short quest for each of them, which then expands into a bigger plot about fighting a faction of necromancers who are growing in power after the Arcane University had banned necromancy. And it's probably not a good idea to prohibit your magical monopoly from using such powerful magic. You're just opening the door to get challenged by a group of mages who do use necromancy. Probably not the best idea. And you even end up scrapping with the legendary necromancer King Marco, who in this game is an absolute bum, who can only cast a handful of spells before he runs out of magicka. Bro came back absolutely washed. Next up is the Thieves Guild, which is a bit more Robin Hood than Robin the Hood, but it's got some really awesome plot hooks like the Grey Fox and the Grey Cowl of Nocturnal, which is a Daedric artifact that erases your existence when you put it on. Even if you put it on right in front of somebody else, they would immediately forget who you are and would only know you as the Grey Fox. And this questline will have you do some actual thievery to progress in the faction, and it all leads up to the heist of an Elder Scroll. Hey, that's the name of the game. Lastly, we got the Dark Brotherhood, and it's probably the most famous faction in Oblivion for some obvious reasons. It's full of interesting quests and twists, from killing off a party of people all locked in the same house together one by one, to killing off your entire Dark Brotherhood sanctuary, and trying to figure out the identity of a traitor who is offing Dark Brotherhood leaders, which it turns out was you all along. It's got the most tonally unique story with the highest stakes, and is carried by Wes Johnson's buttery smooth Lucien Lachance performance. The dude's having a blast with it, you can tell. These factions provide hours and hours of quests that you can lose days to, and they're the real meat of Oblivion outside of the main quest. And each quest from each faction at least tries to give you an interesting scenario with each quest, and some of the quests remain as some of the most highly regarded Elder Scrolls quests to this day, although some factions pull off their stories a little bit better than others. Like I said, I'd have to make a video dedicated to the factions to cover everything, unless I want to inflate this video to patrician TV lengths. But with that, that's most of the base game Oblivion content covered. So now it's time to take a look at the major expansions. Oblivion has several download packs, like Mehrunes Razor, Frostcrack Spire, the Vile Lair, and of course, Horse Armor. This is where it all went wrong. But the only 2 DLCs with enough meat to be considered expansions are the Knights of the Nine and the Shivering Isles. So let's take a look at the Knights of the Nine first, as it's much shorter. The Knights of the Nine is a collection of quests to recover the relics of the Divine Crusader, Pelinal Whitestrake. Pelinal himself was a knight who fought alongside Alessia and her winged Minotaur boyfriend, and son of the divine Kinnereth, Morehouse, who Pelinal shared an uncle and nephew type relationship with. But Pelinal is more than just some strong knight. This dude was more like a goddamn Terminator, which I like to think is a reference to Bethesda's earlier Terminator PC games, and I'm pretty sure Kirkbride even said he's a Terminator reference. Pelinal Whitestrake's true nature is unknown, as some claim he may have been a god in human form, an honest Akatosh cyborg with a laser for an arm, or maybe even the Shezarene, the mortal reincarnation of the god Lorkhan, known as Shazar by the Cyrodiilians. However, he hated any talk of him being a god, and the man who suggested that he was the Shezarene was smothered by moths. When the Nords joined in on Alessia's rebellion, they took one look at Pelinal and said that he was Shor, who was the Nordic version of Lorkhan, reborn, to which Pelinal spat at their feet for such nasty heresy, and led them anyway. Humble guy. According to legend, he had no heart, just having a red amulet and a hole in his chest, and he was probably a time traveler. As he spoke unlike the other humans of the time, he wore some weird armor that he himself admitted was unlike any other armor ever made. And one time, after he killed an Ayleid king and was devouring the veins in his neck, he screamed out praise for someone named Remen, who we know as the future founder of the Second Empire, but had not even been born yet. Pellinol had ascended levels of racism against elves. He spent most of his time baiting alien kings to fight him in combat, and they always would accept over Aryans. Then Pellinol would brutally slaughter them with his overwhelming power, and then would usually cannibalize